They say love finds you when you least expect it. But what if it finds you before it's even supposed to exist? What if the future comes knocking, wearing a ring engraved with your name and a date that hasn't happened yet? This isn't a love story. It's a haunting, a mystery that begins with a silent velvet box and ends with a voice whispering from the walls. Say yes. The knocks started the night she found the ring. Always three, never from the door. In this chilling tale of time, fate, and unseen forces, we unravel the terrifying encounter of a woman caught between what was and what should have been. The ring isn't just a symbol, it's a demand, and every knock brings her closer to a future she didn't choose, but can no longer escape. Stay with us as we uncover what really happens when the knocker leaves a wedding ring from the future. It was a grey Thursday afternoon when everything changed. The kind of day that drags like wet clothes on a line, quiet and unremarkable in every way, until the doorbell rang. There was no sound of a truck, no knock, no shadow passing the frosted window beside the front door, just the bell and a feeling. She opened the door expecting a missed delivery slip, or maybe a flyer for pest control, but there it was, small, square and black, a ring box, velvet soft and damp from the humidity. No name, no address, no footsteps on the stairs, just the box and the weight it seemed to carry. She hesitated. Something inside her recoiled from it, while something else leaned in. She picked it up like it might burn her, but it didn't. It was cold. She opened it slowly, already knowing something was wrong. Inside was a simple gold band, gleaming as if it had never been worn, and etched inside were words she hadn't expected to see. Her name, her full name, first, middle, last, and beneath it, a date. February 14th, 2026, 2 months into the future. She closed the box as if the contents would spill out and ruin her. Her hands trembled. Her heart was too loud in her ears. And for a moment, she stood there on the threshold, caught between disbelief and fear, holding a future she didn't understand and hadn't agreed to. She sat the ring box on the kitchen counter like it was evidence. She wasn't the type to panic, but there was something deeply wrong with it. It wasn't just the engraving. Anyone could have found her name online, maybe played some elaborate trick, but the date, it didn't feel like a prank. It felt like a warning. She texted 2 friends, sent a photo. One joked it was probably her future husband pulling a stunt. The other said to toss it and forget about it. But neither response made her feel better. She Googled her name alongside the date. Nothing. No events, no history, no news stories. She couldn't stop staring at it. The ring had a strange pull, like it wanted to be worn, like it was waiting. She tucked it away in a drawer and tried to focus on work, but her eyes kept drifting back. Every room felt colder, every corner felt closer. That night, when she climbed into bed, she left the ring in the drawer and locked the bedroom door for the first time in months. The apartment was silent, almost too silent. At exactly 2:14 a.m., a sound broke the stillness. 3 knocks, not on the door, on the wall, sharp, deliberate, as if from inside the drywall. She froze, then another 3, this time behind her headboard. She didn't sleep, not even a little. She sat upright with the light on until morning, eyes pinned to the wall like it might breathe. The knocks didn't return, but that didn't make her feel safe. It made her feel watched, like whoever or whatever had knocked, was waiting for her to relax, to lower her guard. When the sun finally bled through the blinds, she got up and opened the drawer. The ring box was there, still closed, still quiet. But her name felt louder than ever. She took the ring out and examined it again, searching for a flaw, a crack in the mystery. It was flawless, perfectly round, warm now from her touch. She turned it over in her palm and felt something strange, like a heartbeat. Imagined, maybe, but she dropped it anyway. It clinked against the counter and rolled in a circle before stopping dead, like something inside had locked it in place. She backed away. The air felt heavier than it should. Her phone buzzed, but when she checked, there were no notifications. Just the time, 2:14 p.m. Same as the knock the night before, same as the date in the ring. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew one thing: this wasn't over. She went downstairs to ask the building manager if anyone had reported a lost package. He barely looked up from his monitor. "Nope," he muttered, chewing a pen cap. She described the box, the ring, even hinted it might be a prank. He shrugged. "Nothing's come through here except for the usual mail. If it didn't have a label, it wasn't dropped off by a courier." She asked about the security cameras. He gestured lazily at a broken monitor. "Offline for weeks." "Sorry, that was the end of that." She felt more unsettled on the way back up than she had on the way down. In her gut she'd hoped someone would explain it away, that it would be boring. But there was no boring answer, not anymore. When she stepped back into her apartment, the smell hit her, not rotting, not chemical, just unfamiliar, like flowers left too long in a closed room. The ring box was no longer on the counter. It was on her coffee table, open, as if presented. She hadn't left it there. She was sure. Her hand shook as she reached for it. And that's when she heard the whisper. One word, low and soft, brushing past her ear like breath. "Yes." She turned so fast, she knocked over the lamp. The room was empty. No windows open, no door ajar, nothing disturbed, except her. That whisper had come from inches away. Not from the hallway, not from her mind, from the space behind her. She scanned every shadow, every closet, even the shower curtain. Nothing, but the whisper echoed in her head like a memory. Yes, yes to what? Yes to who? She didn't know. She tried to go about her evening normally, cooking dinner, playing a podcast, but the background hum of dread wouldn't leave. At one point she found herself staring at the ring again. It looked peaceful, comforting, even like it belonged. And that's what frightened her most. How normal it was beginning to feel. That night, she placed the ring in a kitchen drawer, taped it shut, and placed a heavy book on top. She took a sleeping pill and crawled into bed, praying to wake up without incident. But at 2:14 a.m., on the dot, the knocks came again. This time, from inside the closet. She didn't move. Not for an hour. Not until the knocking stopped. And when she finally rose, her mouth dry, her pulse wild, she opened the drawer in the kitchen and found the tape neatly peeled away and the ring back in its box. The next morning, she left the apartment entirely, drove for hours, stopping at a gas station in a neighboring town just to breathe something different. She bought a cheap motel room for the night, one of those roadside spots with scratchy sheets and humming neon signs. No one knew where she was. She hadn't told a soul. She didn't even bring the ring, left it behind in the drawer, under the book, locked the front door, and took the spare key. Still, at 2:14 a.m., she sat upright in bed,
jolted awake by a sharp knock, not on the motel room door, on the window, second-story window. She stayed still, heart pounding, sweat gathering at her spine. There was no whisper this time, just silence so deep it felt like a scream pressed against her ears. She didn't sleep again. In the morning, she drove back, hoping it had all stopped, that she'd broken the pattern. But when she returned home, the front door was slightly open, and on the threshold, the ring box waited. Clean, scented, open. She stepped back, unable to breathe. This was no prank. This was no coincidence. Something wanted her attention. Something was watching. She didn't touch the ring this time. She slammed the door, bolted it, and called someone, anyone. A friend she hadn't spoken to in months picked up. She tried to explain, told them about the box, the engraving, the knocks. There was a long pause, then laughter. "Girl, that's creepy. Maybe your future husband's a time traveler," they joked. She forced a laugh, but tears stung her eyes. No one understood. No one could. That night, she didn't go to bed. She sat on the floor beside the couch, lights on, heart thudding like a drum. And when the clock struck 2:14, she didn't hear the knocks. She heard a whisper again. "Closer. Say yes," she shouted into the air. To what? But there was no reply, just the faint sound of something breathing.
She stopped talking about it, not because the fear faded, but because it grew more personal, more possessive. The moment she mentioned it to others, the whispers got louder, the knocks more insistent, so she went quiet, isolated. She started sleeping during the day, when the shadows were softer and the air didn't feel as heavy. But it didn't matter. The disturbances adapted. At 2:14 p.m., the microwave beeped on its own. The TV turned to static. The door handle jiggled. She put salt at every window, every threshold. Nothing helped. She even tried to get rid of the ring, tossed it into a storm drain, watched it fall into rushing water and vanish. But that night, the knocks came again, and in the morning the ring was on her pillow. The velvet box, spotless, waiting. There was no blood, no violence, nothing physical, just the relentless presence of something waiting. And every time she tried to ignore it, the whisper returned. Say yes. It didn't sound angry. It didn't plead. It was simply expectant. She began keeping a journal, not to document what was happening. She already knew she'd never forget, but to ask questions. What was it asking her to say yes to? Who was knocking? Was it a person? A ghost? A version of herself? The ring felt heavier with each passing day, as though the date inside was pulling it, and her closer to something she couldn't stop. February 14th, 2026. Less than 2 months away. She began to dread it, like a deadline, a trap. She circled the day on the calendar, then tore the page out, unable to look at it. Still, she knew the day was coming. The knocks never changed, always 3. The voice never altered, always the same gentle murmur. But once, after she yelled, "I don't understand," into the empty room, the voice replied with something new, a single, chilling sentence. "You will." She stopped journaling after that. No one should be able to answer back. The sleep deprivation warped everything. She couldn't tell if time was passing or standing still. She stopped checking clocks, especially at 2:14. Her dreams weren't hers anymore. In them, she saw long hallways lined with candles, dark figures standing at the end, heads bowed. A man in black with a face blurred by static. He never moved, but she knew he was the one who whispered. Every dream ended the same way. He would raise his hand, offer the ring, and tilt his head slowly, and every time she would wake just as the word formed on her lips. Yes. One night, she tried staying awake to avoid the dream, but she blinked and woke up with the ring on her finger. Her heart nearly stopped. She yanked it off and flung it across the room. It didn't bounce. It landed flat with a metallic thud and stayed there, still as stone. She crawled across the carpet, picked it up. No burn marks, no pain, but the weight of it now felt unbearable. She dropped it in the freezer, out of desperation. It didn't help. The next night, it was back on her nightstand. She began to wonder if it had already happened. Whatever this was, this event, this choice, it felt inevitable, as if she had already made it, and was now simply catching up to it. She stopped going outside. She barely ate, and yet she didn't feel sick. She felt watched over, as though something was protecting her in preparation. The scariest part wasn't the fear. It was the familiarity, the sense that this had all happened before. Déjà vu settled like fog on her shoulders. Every knock sounded like a memory, every whisper like a long-forgotten promise. She tried researching similar events, rings showing up from nowhere, haunted objects, tied to time loops, but nothing matched. No cursed object lore explained the gentleness of it all. This wasn't a curse, it was a courtship, and somehow she was at the center of it, not chosen by force, but by fate. On the last night of January, something changed. The ring was no longer on the nightstand. It was in the bathroom, balanced on the rim of the sink, like someone had been about to propose. She stared at it for a long time, not moving, not breathing. Then she said it out loud, "I'm not ready," and the whisper replied immediately, "You will be." That night, the dream didn't come. No man in the hallway, no candles, just darkness. A gentle kind of silence, and for the first time in weeks, she slept deeply. When she woke, she found something beside the ring box, a piece of torn paper, with words scrawled in unfamiliar handwriting. It read, "Meet me halfway," no name, no instructions, but she understood. This wasn't about consent, this was about surrender, and the date was only 2 weeks away. She decided to test it. If it wanted her to say yes, then what would happen if she said no? She stood in the center of the living room, ring in one hand, phone in the other. She hit record and spoke clearly. "I reject this. I refuse. I do not say yes." She waited. Silence. For an hour, nothing happened. She breathed easier, even laughed nervously. Maybe that was the end. Maybe that had been the point to resist. But at exactly 2:14 a.m., every light in her apartment turned off at once. The bulb above her sparked and shattered. Her phone screen went black. Then a whisper louder than ever, not in her ear this time, but from every wall, from the floor, from the ceiling. "Wrong answer," she screamed. Not out of pain, but betrayal. She dropped the phone. She dropped the ring. The room pulsed, not with sound, but with pressure. And then, silence. True, deafening silence. The kind that hums in your bones. She fell asleep on the floor that night, without intending to. When she woke up, the ring was back in the box, and the words, "Say yes," were scratched into her bedroom wall. She painted over it, but the words bled through. No matter how many coats, she even replaced the panel. The next day, it appeared on the mirror, etched as if by a diamond tip. She covered every reflective surface, took down every frame, lived in dull light. Her home became a bunker, and still, the countdown continued. The whispers grew softer, but more constant.
a hum in her daily life. She couldn't even say her name without thinking about the engraving. Couldn't look at the calendar without feeling the weight of the 14th. It was like she was slipping into a place outside of time, half in this world, half in another. A waiting room for something unspeakable. And yet, deep down, a new emotion began to form beneath the fear. Not hope, not peace, curiosity, a sick, inexplicable desire to see what would happen if she just said the word.
The day before February began, she found herself standing outside a jewelry store downtown. She didn't plan it. She had walked aimlessly for hours and just ended up there. The shop was closed, lights off, but in the window was a display of rings, some vintage, some custom, some almost identical to the one haunting her. One of them was even engraved, although faintly. She pressed her forehead to the glass like a child, whispering, "Where did you come from?" Not to the store, to the ring, to the entity behind it. That night she dreamt again, but this time she wasn't in a hallway. She was standing at an altar in a chapel without walls. Wind circled her, but didn't touch her. The sky was dark purple, like dusk in reverse. And at the other end of the aisle stood the figure, taller now, closer, a man-shaped shadow in a black suit. No face, no sound, just his hand extended, and the ring box in his palm. She looked down at herself in the dream, and saw a wedding dress, elegant, clean, but nothing she had ever owned. In the dream she hesitated. Then, as if not entirely of her own will, she reached for the ring. Just as her fingers grazed it, she woke up gasping, sweat-soaked and breathless. And on her nightstand, the box was open again. She tried to recall the dream in detail, but parts were already slipping away. All she could remember was the dress, the wind, the soundlessness of it all. A ceremony with no witnesses, a moment that had been waiting to happen. She scribbled down fragments in the journal she'd abandoned. She wrote only one phrase, "It's not a haunting, it's a proposal." That realization shook her more than the whispers. Because if she was right, then this wasn't about scaring her. This was about choosing her. The knocks weren't threats, they were invitations. The whispers weren't commands, they were vows. But that begged the real question. Who was on the other side? A ghost? A version of her from another life? Or something else entirely? Something that didn't belong to time, as she understood it. She walked around her apartment, as though someone might answer her aloud. She asked, "Why now?" No reply. But that night, the whisper changed again. It said, "Because you already did." She stopped questioning reality and started preparing for inevitability. Something was coming. The ring, the whispers, the dreams, it was all leading somewhere, and she was beginning to believe resistance was no longer an option. She marked off the days on her wall, red slashes on bare plaster. No more calendar, no more journal, just waiting. At 2:14 a.m., every night, she would sit in silence, eyes open, ears straining, and every time, the knocks would come. 3, never more, never less. She never tried answering them again, but she didn't run from them either. She listened, allowed them to echo. One night, something different happened. After the knocks, a single tap, lighter, like a fingertip. Then silence. She moved toward the wall, hand trembling, and gently tapped back. Once, nothing followed, but she felt it. A presence, right on the other side. A closeness. The kind of closeness that should have made her skin crawl but didn't. It felt intimate, familiar. That night, she didn't sleep in fear. She slept in strange anticipation. She started noticing the changes in herself. The way mirrors seemed to ripple slightly when she passed. The way shadows bent toward her, as though drawn by gravity. The way people looked at her on the street, confused, unsettled, like they sensed something just behind her. Even animals behaved oddly. Dogs barked, cats froze. A pigeon smacked into her window and died instantly, neck twisted at an impossible angle. She began staying inside full time, not because she feared what was out there, but because she feared what was following her out there. February was now only 10 days away. Every morning, she found something new beside the ring box. A petal, a dried leaf, a thread of red fabric, offerings, or reminders. She started placing her own items in return. A hairpin, a coin, a button. Each night, something else was added to the exchange. The knocks remained, but they softened, became part of her new rhythm, part of her. She was no longer just being haunted. She was becoming a part of whatever this was. Then came the vision, not a dream, not a memory, a vision. She was in her apartment, but everything was different. The furniture was moved, the walls painted. There were photos on the shelf, photos of her, older, smiling, standing beside someone whose face had been erased by static. But his hand was on hers, a wedding ring on her finger. The same one. She stared at the image in the vision until she blinked, and it was gone. But it had felt real, as if she had seen a version of herself that already lived through it all. That night, she found a folded piece of paper beneath the ring box. In handwriting that mimicked hers, but wasn't, were the words, "We're happy, just say yes." That broke her, not with fear, with grief. Because deep down, she had always feared she'd never have that life. And now, something was offering it to her. But at a cost she didn't understand. She wept for hours, for the weight of the ring, for the woman in the photograph, for the version of herself that might never exist if she continued to resist. She wasn't being offered a love story. She was being offered a rewrite, a reset, but the terms were veiled in shadow. What would she lose if she said yes? Would she still be herself? Would she vanish? Would she become that woman smiling in the future, or be replaced by her? Was this even love, or possession dressed in romance? She didn't know, and the voice wouldn't say. But the knocks kept coming, and now they sounded closer, almost inside her skull, at 2:14 a.m. The next night, she didn't wait for them. She stood in the middle of the room and whispered back, "I need more." A long pause followed. Then, for the first time, the whisper was not a word. It was a sound, a soft exhale, not from behind her, from inside her, as if whatever was reaching out had already begun to take root. The following days were filled with disconnection. She would lose time, forget entire hours, find herself standing in rooms she didn't remember entering. She called out to herself, recorded videos, just to confirm she hadn't changed. But when she rewatched them, her eyes looked wrong, deeper, brighter, at times smiling when her mouth hadn't moved. One night, she woke up to find the walls covered in writing. Every surface, every wall, every mirror, just one phrase, repeated over and over in hundreds of variations, scribbled in 100 different hands. Say yes, say yes, say yes. She tried scrubbing them off, but the words reappeared the next night. She stopped trying. She accepted the countdown. February 14th was now just 3 days away, and she could feel the shift in the air. Every minute felt like a held breath. Every hour, a heartbeat.
Not hers, something else's, something ancient, and waiting.
The final 3 days moved like water thick with ash, slow, suffocating, and dense with meaning. Every night, the knocks grew softer, almost sorrowful. The whispers no longer came at 2:14. They were constant now, gentle murmurs in the space between thoughts. She couldn't hear them with her ears anymore. She felt them like vibrations through her blood. She stopped eating, stopped dressing. She wore only a robe and walked barefoot through the apartment, as if it were no longer hers, as if she were renting it from something watching patiently. Her dreams changed too. Now she saw the man not just standing, but waiting, offering her his hand. He never stepped closer. He always waited for her to bridge the distance, and each night she got closer. 1 step, then 2, then 10, until finally the space between them was only the length of a breath. On the night before the 14th, she tried to leave. Something deep in her survival instincts screamed at her to run. She packed a small bag, grabbed her keys, and made it halfway to the front door before she stopped. Not because she couldn't move, because she realized there was no leaving. Her legs went numb. Her mouth wouldn't form the words. And in that moment, the apartment seemed to shift around her, shrinking inward like a living organism preparing to swallow. The ring box was on the doormat outside. She hadn't placed it there. It hadn't been there minutes earlier. Yet now it sat waiting like always, clean, unbothered, eternal. She bent down to pick it up. When she opened it, the ring glowed, not brightly, just enough to show it was no longer made of metal. It pulsed, a faint light beneath its surface, breathing, alive. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She brought it inside and placed it on the kitchen table. The whispers hushed immediately. That night, there were no knocks, no whispers, no dreams, only stillness, like the air was holding its breath. She slept, not because she chose to, but because she was allowed to. And when she awoke on February 14th, she didn't reach for her phone. She didn't speak. She simply rose and walked to the mirror. Her reflection looked the same, but not quite. The room behind her shimmered faintly. The colors were warmer. The shadows were softer. She reached for the ring box. Inside, the ring had changed again. It still bore her name, still bore the date, but something new had been etched beside them. A symbol, not one she recognized, not human. She traced it with her finger. The moment she did, her vision flickered. The room shook, and the floor beneath her seemed to pull downward slightly, like gravity adjusting. Something had shifted. The apartment had become a liminal space, a hallway between realities, and she stood in the center of it. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to go, that the choice had been made long before she'd found the ring. That saying yes wasn't an answer. It was a remembering. At 2:14 p.m., she sat in the middle of the living room floor. The light through the window turned golden, though the sun outside was pale. Time didn't move the way it used to. The air was warm. The shadows didn't fall where they should. She placed the ring on her finger, not out of fear, not out of surrender, but because it fit, because it had always fit. The moment it slid over her knuckle, the room sighed. Every object, every wall, every corner exhaled, and from the hallway, the knocks returned. Not loud, not demanding. They were soft, final, a call, a countdown. 1, 2, 3. She rose, legs trembling, and moved toward the sound. She opened the door. Behind it was not the hallway. It was a corridor of light, endless, soft, silent, floating dust suspended in time. And at the far end, the man, the one from her dreams, standing still, waiting. But this time, she could see something else. His outline shimmered, and in his other hand, not holding a box, but a photo of her, a real photo, one she didn't remember taking. In it she was smiling, radiant, wearing the same ring. Beside him, together, she didn't know what was real anymore. Whether this was a memory or a manipulation, whether she was stepping into destiny or disappearing into something else. But she stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, and with each step her heartbeat slowed, as if sinking to something older, something deeper, as if the future wasn't something she was walking toward, but something she was returning to. When she reached him, the figure held out his hand. She placed hers in it. No words, no whisper, just stillness. The corridor behind them vanished. The light faded, and they stood in a space without sky. No time, no floor, just endless silence. He raised her hand to his lips. Not a kiss, just contact. The feeling was not love, not fear, but completion. As though a cycle had been sealed, as though she had done this before, and would again. He placed his hand over the ring, and whispered one final phrase. It's done. And in that moment, she vanished. Back in the apartment, the furniture sat untouched. The air was still. The calendar remained blank. But on the kitchen table, the ring box was gone. The only sign of her ever being there was a single photo, fresh, unframed, placed neatly by the window. In it she stood smiling, hand held by a man whose face was still blurred. But the date printed on the back was not February 14th. It was the following year, February 14th, 2027. And beneath it, a message written in her handwriting, though she never wrote it. It simply said, "I said yes." The future is already inside the room. The apartment didn't stay empty for long. A new tenant moved in 3 weeks after the last one disappeared. No warnings, no forwarding address, no goodbye. The landlord said she'd simply stopped paying rent, and after a legally required waiting period, the lease was terminated. The new tenant, a quiet woman with no family in town, thought the place had an odd smell. Not bad, just old, stale like dust and memory. She scrubbed the walls, replaced the curtains, hung new mirrors, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something else still lived there, something that hadn't left with the last tenant. On her third night, she found a hairpin in the kitchen drawer wedged behind the cutlery. She didn't use hairpins, but she kept it, thinking it might have sentimental value. She placed it on the table, meaning to return it to the building manager. But when she woke the next morning, it was gone. In its place was a coin, a strange one. No date, no country, just a symbol, curved, elegant, unfamiliar. She assumed it was some antique token or foreign currency. She placed it in a small dish by the door and forgot about it. That night, she dreamed of standing in front of her own door, knocking 3 times. But inside the dream she was on both sides. She knocked, and she answered. She asked who was there, and she whispered, "Say yes." She woke up gasping, skin slick with sweat. No memory of what had happened next, just the knocks echoing in her chest. That day she tried brushing it off. Strange dreams were common in new places, she reasoned. Stress, old wiring, disrupted sleep patterns. She turned on music, cleaned the apartment again, and tried to settle in. But everything felt slightly off. Her reflection moved a fraction slower than her real movements. Her phone's clock paused at 2:14 every afternoon. A bag of rice in her pantry toppled over for no reason. Little things. Not enough to call the police, but enough to start keeping the lights on through the night. By the end of the first week, the new tenant had stopped sleeping in her bedroom. She didn't know why. It just didn't feel right. She dragged her mattress into the living room, but even then, the sense of being observed never faded. It was like a tension hanging in the air, not dangerous, just expectant, as if something was waiting for her to do something she hadn't been told to do. One night, she found herself sitting in the dark, staring at the front door. No reason, no fear, just waiting. At 2:14 a.m., a soft click echoed from the kitchen. The drawer, the one where she'd found the hairpin. She rose slowly, barefoot on cold tile, and opened it. Inside was the coin again, this time with something new. A slip of paper, blank except for one phrase, "You're next." She dropped it and backed away, slamming the drawer shut. But her heart didn't pound. Her mind didn't scream. Deep down, a part of her wasn't even surprised. She started researching the apartment, old tenants, past incidents. The landlord claimed nothing strange had ever happened. No deaths, no crimes, no break-ins. But an anonymous blog post surfaced in a forgotten forum from 2 years ago. A woman had described the same address, same apartment number. She wrote about whispers at night, knocks from the walls, a ring that appeared from nowhere. I didn't want to say yes. The post ended, but I think I already had. There were no other entries, no profile photo, no replies. The post had been deleted a month later, but cached archives kept it floating. She stared at it for hours, then typed a comment into the void. What happens if I don't say anything? She hit enter. A minute later, a reply appeared. No username, no timestamp, just "That's still an answer." That night, she woke up to a thud on the front mat. Not a knock, an object landing. She opened the door slowly, expecting to see a delivery. A prank, an animal. Instead, it was a box, velvet, black. The moment her eyes saw it, something inside her shifted. A pull, a tightening, a déjà vu so deep it made her dizzy. She didn't pick it up. She couldn't. Her hands trembled just looking at it. She slid it inside with her foot and stared at it for hours from across the room. She didn't sleep, didn't speak, just watched. When dawn came, she found herself whispering the words before she even understood what they meant. Whose future is this? The ring inside bore no name, no engraving, just that same symbol from the coin. No date, no clues, but the metal buzzed faintly in her palm, and her breath caught when she realized she already knew what it wanted. On the 7th day, the voice came. Not a whisper, a murmur deep in her chest, like her own voice turned inward. It didn't speak in words, not exactly, just an idea. Return what was promised. She searched the apartment, top to bottom, looking for something that didn't belong to her, didn't originate from her life. And in a box under the bathroom sink, taped to the back of a loose panel, she found a photo, a woman's face, not hers, a stranger, laughing, smiling, hand outstretched to the camera, a ring on her finger, and in her eyes, peace. But behind her, faint and blurred, stood something tall, a man in a black suit, faceless, watching. She dropped the photo and collapsed to the floor. This wasn't just a haunted apartment. This was a relay, a passage. Something passed from one person to the next, a promise or a contract. And the ring,
was the seal. She didn't know what to do. Burn the box, leave it on a stranger's doorstep, throw it into the ocean. But deep down, she feared doing any of those things would only make it worse. Because she didn't find the ring. The ring had found her. She tried ignoring it. But the days began to repeat. Time looped. On the 8th day, her phone re-downloaded old voicemails. On the 9th, her groceries spoiled the moment she brought them in. On the 10th, the lights began flickering in patterns. 3 flashes, then silence, then 3 again. And on the 11th day, the voice returned, clearer now, more intimate. It spoke one word, and this time, it was her name.
The sound of her name spoken in the dark was not like hearing someone call from another room. It was different, closer, as if it had been breathed directly into her bones. She froze in bed, afraid to move, afraid to even blink. Her pulse throbbed against the silence, but there was no follow-up sound, no footsteps, no second whisper. She tried convincing herself it was a dream, but deep down she knew it wasn't. She sat up, every part of her trembling, and scanned the apartment. It looked the same, silent, still, but something in the air felt heavier. It wasn't until she turned toward the living room that she noticed it. The ring box, now open, sitting on the coffee table. It hadn't been there when she went to bed. The ring shimmered faintly in the dim light, waiting like a question left unanswered. She didn't touch it. She couldn't, but she couldn't look away either. Her name still echoed in her ears like a note hanging in the air, reverberating. The coin was still in its dish by the door, but now there was something carved into the surface. A date, not hers, not yet, but close. February 14th, 2027. The same date she had seen before on the photo of the other woman. She staggered back from it, but her foot caught on something. A slip of paper, blank, except for 3 words in unfamiliar handwriting. "It's almost time." Her breath caught. She stuffed the note into her pocket and left the coin and ring untouched. But the air around them seemed to hum softly, as if their presence was enough to answer questions she hadn't even asked. She began to hear the knocks again. Not every night at first, but more often. 3 knocks. Always at 2:14 a.m., sometimes from the wall, sometimes from the floor, once from the headboard of her bed. She started sleeping in the living room to avoid it, but the knocks followed her there too. The voice came again on the 13th night. This time it didn't call her name. It only said 2 words, "Say yes." The sound sent a cold weight rolling through her chest. She thought of the blog post from years ago. The way the writer had said, "I think I already had." She didn't know what it meant yet, but she felt herself sliding toward the same point. A decision she hadn't yet made, but somehow had already committed to. She decided to test the apartment. She left for the weekend, booking a room 2 towns over. No ring, no coin, no whispers, no knocks. She stayed away, convinced she had outsmarted whatever was inside that space. But at exactly 2:14 a.m. on the second night, a knock echoed at her hotel door. She froze, heart pounding. Another 3 knocks followed. She crept to the door, pressed her ear to it. Nothing, no footsteps, no breath. She opened the door slowly. Nothing, only the hallway, empty. But at her feet was the velvet box, neatly placed, open. The ring inside gleamed. She slammed the door, locked it, and left the next morning. She returned to the apartment shaking, but when she walked in, the coin dish was empty. That night, she sat in silence waiting. No music, no TV, no distractions. She wanted to hear it, if the voice came again. At 2:14 a.m., she didn't hear a knocks. She heard a sigh, deep, heavy, almost disappointed. Then a sound from the kitchen drawer, the one where the hairpin had appeared. She opened it slowly. Inside was the photo again. This time, it wasn't the laughing woman. It was her own face, the same blurred man in the background, the same ring on her finger. The photo looked old, faded around the edges, but it was her, older, smiling. Her stomach dropped. It wasn't a warning, it was a record. She left the photo on the table and stared at it for hours. The details unsettled her. Her clothes weren't ones she owned. The furniture behind her wasn't hers either. And yet, she looked content, peaceful. There was no fear in her expression, only acceptance. She whispered to herself, "That's not me." But even as she said it, she felt doubt crawl in. What if it was her? What if all of this wasn't about changing her future, but about guiding her toward the one she'd already chosen? The knocks came again that night, softer than before, almost like a heartbeat. And when the voice returned, it said something different. Not "say yes," not her name, just a quiet, steady promise. "You'll understand." The next morning, she checked her reflection and noticed something strange. A faint indentation on her ring finger, subtle but there. She touched it with trembling hands. It wasn't painful, it felt natural, as though the ring had been there for years, and she had only just noticed. She rushed to the coin dish by the door, but the coin was gone. In its place was another slip of paper, 3 new words. "It begins soon." She stared at the words for a long time, her hands shaking as she realized whatever was coming wasn't waiting for her permission anymore. It was already here. The indentation on her finger became impossible to ignore. It wasn't deep, but it was undeniable. She stopped wearing gloves because they made her skin feel heavy. Every time she glanced down, she swore she could see the faintest shimmer, like metal hidden just beneath the surface of her skin. The ring box was still on the table, unopened for days, yet somehow the presence of the ring was constant. It was as if the object had detached itself from physical reality. It was inside her now, not in the way curses live in haunted objects, but in the way memories live in bones. At night, when she tried to sleep, her finger throbbed faintly in time with the soft knocks that came from somewhere deep within the walls. She began noticing other changes. When she stood near mirrors, she thought she saw movement in her periphery, not shadows, not figures, herself, but not exactly as she was now. These reflections looked slightly older, slightly changed, sometimes smiling faintly, sometimes standing beside someone, just out of frame. She tried covering the mirrors, but every time she removed the coverings, days later or hours later, they would be perfectly clean, like someone had wiped them in her absence. The whispers grew more constant, now coming in the middle of the day, always gentle, always calm, as if whatever was calling to her wasn't trying to frighten her anymore, but prepare her. The date on the coin dish shifted again. It now read February 14th, 2028. Another year forward, another silent message. This doesn't end. She thought of the photograph again, the one of her smiling in a life she didn't remember. Was this a cycle? Did every tenant inherit the same object, the same whispers, the same fate? Or was she the only one looping? It was impossible to tell. That night, at 2:14 a.m., she heard something new. Not knocks, not her name, but footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing in the hallway outside her door. She didn't move, didn't breathe. She knew what came next. The steps stopped. 3 knocks followed. She almost didn't answer, but this time something inside her hand twitched. She rose slowly, barefoot on cold floor, and walked to the door. She didn't open it. She just pressed her palm to the wood. On the other side, silence. Then a soft tap in the exact place her hand rested. Like someone returning the gesture, her throat tightened. She whispered, "I'm here." No response came, just a quiet shift in the air. When she pulled her hand back, the indentation on her finger felt deeper, warmer, almost alive. Over the next few days, she started to lose track of herself. Hours passed without memory. She would find herself standing in the doorway, looking at the box, with no idea how long she had been there. Her phone's camera showed static when she tried to take photos of the ring. The whispers began saying small sentences now. "Soon. Almost. You'll see." She tried leaving again, but the outside world didn't feel real anymore. The air felt thin. People's voices sounded distorted. Her apartment, despite everything, was the only place that felt solid, familiar, waiting. On February 13th, she woke to find the coin dish empty again. In its place was the photograph of her, but changed. In this one, her hand was clearly visible. The ring gleamed on her finger, and she wasn't alone. The blurred man was closer now, his hand resting on hers. But the blur around him looked different, sharper, as though he was becoming more real. The back of the photograph had new writing. "Tomorrow, at 2:14. She set the photo down, her hands trembling. She didn't need to ask what would happen. The apartment had been answering her for weeks. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat at the table, the ring box open in front of her, staring at the curve of metal inside. The knocks didn't come. The voice didn't speak. The apartment was still, silent. It was the silence of something holding its breath. She kept her finger hovering above the ring, feeling that strange magnetic pull, not forcing, not demanding, just waiting. And deep down she knew whatever happened tomorrow, she had already chosen it. The only question left was whether she would remember choosing. February 14th. Arrived without ceremony. No storm, no signs, no unusual movement in the apartment. The air felt heavy, but not oppressive, just patient. She didn't eat breakfast. She didn't move much. She simply sat in the same chair she had been sitting in for hours, watching the clock. Every second sounded louder than it should have, like time itself was pressing in. Her finger tingled faintly, as if anticipating the weight of the ring. She stared at the box on the table. The metal inside no longer looked cold. It looked warm, like it had been waiting in someone's hand. When the clock reached 2:14 p.m., the room shifted almost imperceptibly. The air grew warmer. The light bent faintly, and from the hallway, 3 soft knocks. She rose slowly, not hurried, not resisting. She walked to the door, each step feeling both familiar and foreign. She stood with her hand on the knob for a long moment. Her breathing slowed. She didn't open it. She just listened. A voice came, quiet but clear. "Say yes." It wasn't pleading. It wasn't commanding. It was steady. She didn't reply. She only turned back toward the table. The ring sat waiting. Her heart beat in a strange rhythm, slow, deep, as though sinking to something else. She picked up the box. The knocks came again, softer this time. She slipped the ring onto her finger. The moment it settled, the air in the room changed. A deep stillness fell over everything. The clock stopped ticking. The faint hum of the refrigerator vanished. Even her own breath felt suspended. The knocks stopped completely, but from the other side of the door came the softest sound, yet a sigh, a sound of completion, a sound of something returning home. She stood frozen in the silence, not sure if she had moved, or if the world around her had shifted instead. The door opened. She didn't turn the knob. It simply opened, slowly, without resistance. On the other side was not the hallway she knew. It was a space of pale, endless light. No floor, no ceiling. A place that seemed to go on forever without moving. And in the distance, the man in the black suit, his face still blurred, but his presence sharper now. He didn't move toward her. He just waited. She stepped forward once, her bare foot touching nothing, and yet finding purchase. She glanced back once. The apartment looked smaller, dimmer, like it was receding. As she walked forward, the light around her grew warmer. The man extended his hand. She hesitated for a breath, then placed hers in it. His touch was neither warm nor cold. It was steady, certain. He didn't speak, but the air around them whispered faintly, "It's done." Her vision flickered. She saw flashes of herself, smiling, wearing the ring, standing beside him, in places she didn't recognize. Years passing, moments that hadn't happened yet, but felt as familiar as memory. Then everything went dark. When she opened her eyes, she was standing in the apartment again. The light was normal. The door was closed, but everything felt different. The ring was still on her finger. The clock was ticking again, and the box was gone. She moved through the rooms slowly. Nothing had changed physically, but the air was lighter, calmer. The whispers were gone. The knocks had stopped. It was over, or at least, this part was. She caught her reflection in the mirror. She looked the same, but the indentation on her finger was gone, replaced by the faint gleam of the ring. On the table by the window was a single item, the photograph. She turned it over. The date on the back was February 14th, 2028. Her heart stopped for a moment. This was the next one. The next moment in the cycle. Someone else would be next. She placed the photo back down carefully. She didn't know if she felt relief or dread. She only knew one thing. The knocks were silent. For now. The apartment didn't stay empty long. It never did. This time, the new tenant moved in quietly. A man with little more than a suitcase and a habit of staying out late. He noticed nothing unusual during the first week. The place was a little cold, but nothing a heater couldn't fix. He arranged his belongings, filled the shelves, ignored the faint marks on the walls where pictures had once hung. But on his third night, he noticed a photograph on the windowsill. It wasn't his. It showed a woman he didn't recognize, smiling faintly, her hand partially visible. A ring caught the light. He tossed it in a drawer, assuming it was left behind. The apartment felt normal until the sixth night. That was when the first knock came. 3 taps at 2:14 a.m., sharp and measured, like someone tapping wood deliberately. He opened the door to an empty hallway. The sound unsettled him, but he brushed it off as old pipes or shifting walls. On the 7th night, the same knock came again, the same time. This time, he didn't open the door, he just listened. 3 precise knocks, then silence. The next morning, he noticed something strange, a faint indentation on the table where a small box might have sat for years. By the 10th day, he began to notice the apartment had a rhythm. Certain creaks and hums came at the same time. Each day, the clock in the living room seemed to hesitate at 2:14, as if time itself lagged. On the 12th night, the knock didn't come from the door. It came from the wall near his bed. 3 measured taps. He sat up, heart pounding, listening to the silence afterward. He tried ignoring it, but his sleep grew restless. He began to dream of hallways filled with pale light. One morning, after a night of uneasy sleep, he found an object on his kitchen table, a coin, small, smooth, with a strange symbol engraved. No date, no writing, just the symbol. He picked it up and set it near the door, thinking he'd bring it to the landlord. That night, the knocks returned, but they sounded softer, closer. He left the coin where it was. The next morning, it was gone. In its place was a slip of paper with 3 words written in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. "It's your turn." The man started staying out later to avoid the knocks, but no matter where he was, 2:14 a.m. found him. Once, at a friend's place, he woke to a faint tapping on the window. 3 knocks. He left in the middle of the night, uneasy. He returned home and found the coin back in its dish by the door. It wasn't just the apartment, it was him. The cycle wasn't tied to walls, it was tied to whoever lived there. 2 weeks in, he found the box. It wasn't on the table, it wasn't even hidden, it was just there. One morning, in the center of his living room. Velvet, black. He didn't open it, he didn't touch it. But from that moment on, the air felt different. He began hearing faint whispers, not loud enough to make out words. Just a tone, a suggestion. And every night, the knocks came without fail. On February 13th, the whispers grew clearer. "Tomorrow," they said. Tomorrow, at 2:14, his breath caught. He didn't know what would happen. He didn't know why. But when the clock reached that time, he knew something would arrive. He sat awake, staring at the box. It stayed closed. The knocks didn't come, but from somewhere in the apartment, he thought he heard a faint sigh. The 14th of February arrived quietly, with none of the cinematic drama he had subconsciously expected. No storms, no strange smells, no physical signs of what had been building. The apartment was just as still as it had been the night before, but there was something deeper in the air, a tension that wasn't loud, wasn't visible, but clung to everything like an invisible weight. When he woke, it was early. Earlier than usual, he could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, though it seemed slower than it should have been. Each second stretched a little longer than the last, like the entire apartment was exhaling in elongated breaths. His gaze inevitably drifted toward the table. The box was still there. It had not moved. It had not been touched. Yet there was a feeling as if its presence had grown, as if it now occupied more space than its small size should allow. He felt the same resistance as always, that quiet push and pull in his chest. He wanted to throw it away, and yet he wanted to protect it. The contradiction lived in him without explanation, and the closer the clock moved toward the hour, the heavier that contradiction became. By noon, the stillness began to feel heavier, the silence more intentional. It was as though the apartment was trying to contain something, like the walls had tightened to hold whatever was coming. He decided he could not take it. He grabbed his keys and stepped toward the hallway, determined to put space between himself and whatever waited here. But the moment he crossed the threshold, something was wrong. The hallway felt stretched. He had walked it dozens of times in the last weeks, yet now every step seemed to take him further from his goal. His breath misted faintly in the air, a strange chill licking his skin even though it was a mild winter's day. He looked toward the end of the corridor, but the light fixture there seemed dimmer, farther away than it should be. He turned back toward his apartment, and in that moment the distance shrank instantly. 2 steps brought him back to his own door, the key still warm in his palm. Without thinking, he stepped back inside. The box remained in the same place. It was as if the apartment itself had rejected his attempt to leave. When 2:14 approached, he stopped pretending he could outrun it. The weight in the room shifted in subtle ways. He sat motionless, waiting for what he knew was coming. The first knock came exactly on time. 3 soft, measured taps against the inside of the door. He froze in place. His body wanted to respond, but another part of him, the deeper, quieter part, stayed still, knowing the importance of silence. The knocks repeated after a pause, each one precise, each one deliberate. Then came the voice. It was steady and low, close to the wood, and somehow threaded with an almost intimate tone. "Say yes." He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing emerged. His throat felt locked. His silence seemed to stretch for minutes, though the clock's slow movement told him it was only seconds. And in that silence, he realized something. The voice wasn't waiting for him to answer in words. The box opened by itself. He had not touched it. The lid lifted with a soft, soundless motion, as though time had bent for it alone. Inside, the ring sat exactly as before, though something about it felt alive. The metal seemed faintly warm, pulsing almost imperceptibly, the way skin pulses when blood flows beneath it. His chest tightened as the same magnetic pull as before drew him closer, not through compulsion, but inevitability. This wasn't a demand, it wasn't a threat. It was the completion of something that had been waiting. The voice came again, softer now, almost coaxing. "It's already yours." The words settled in his chest, like a truth that had always been there, hidden just beneath awareness. He stepped closer, the box seeming to grow in his vision. His hand shook as it hovered over the ring, but the shaking was no longer fear. The moment his fingers brushed the ring, everything in the apartment changed. Silence deepened in a way he had never experienced before. The refrigerator's hum vanished. The clock stopped ticking. The faint background noises from outside, footsteps in the hall, muffled cars in the distance, evaporated completely. It was as if the entire world had held still for this single point in time. He lifted the ring and slipped it onto his finger. The fit was perfect, as if the metal had been shaped for him. The warmth traveled from his hand through his arm, settling into his chest like an echo of someone else's heartbeat. The knocks ceased entirely. The silence felt not empty, but completed. And then, from the other side of the door, came the sound of a sigh. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was a sound of relief, of something closing. The door opened by itself. He didn't touch the knob. It swung inward slowly, revealing not the hallway he knew, but an expanse of pale light stretching endlessly. There was no floor he could see, no walls to contain it, and yet he somehow knew there was space to step. At the far end of that corridor stood the blurred man from his dreams. His shape was sharper now, though the face remained obscured as always. He did not step forward. He did not call out. He only extended his hand, waiting. The man hesitated, every nerve in his body pulling both backward and forward at the same time. Then, as if the decision had already been made long before this day, he stepped across the threshold. His foot found invisible ground. The apartment behind him seemed smaller now, dimmer, receding like a fading memory.
He moved toward the figure. With every step, the light around him grew warmer. The figure did not speak, but his presence was absolute. When the man reached him, he placed his hand in the blurred figure's extended palm. The touch was neither warm nor cold. It was constant, steady, the kind of touch that felt inevitable, not chosen. The moment their hands met, his vision fractured into flashes. He saw himself in moments yet to come, different years, different rooms, different places, but always wearing the ring, always beside the figure. And then, as the vision slowed, he heard the same words whispered in a voice that felt older than memory. "It's done." The light collapsed into darkness. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the apartment. The room was exactly as it had been. The clock ticked again. The refrigerator hummed faintly. The door was shut. The ring was still on his finger, warm against his skin. The velvet box was gone. The table was bare except for one object, a single photograph. In it, he was smiling faintly, the ring glinting on his hand. The blurred figure stood beside him, closer now, his outline sharper than before. On the back of the photograph was a date, February 14th, 2029. The cycle had already marked its next turn.
The apartment stayed quiet for 3 days. The man barely moved through the rooms, moving only when necessary, like the walls themselves were aware of him now. The ring never left his finger, not because he feared it might disappear, but because removing it didn't feel possible anymore. It wasn't fused to his skin, but there was a heaviness there, an impression that this was the only place it belonged. He tried once, briefly, to slide it off. It resisted, not physically, but in a deeper, older way, as though something unseen pressed against his hand. When he gave up, a strange calm settled into him. The knocks never came in those 3 days. The whispers didn't either. The silence was not a relief, but a suspension. He felt as if something was preparing itself, waiting patiently for the next step. It was only on the 4th night that the stillness shifted again. The photograph on the table turned slightly, as if moved by an unseen hand, so that the date on the back faced upward. February 14th, 2029. It wasn't just a date, it was an instruction. He tried to ignore it. He covered the photograph with an old receipt, thinking it might help. It didn't. Each time he returned to the table, the paper had shifted aside, the date visible again. It wasn't taunting. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. He thought about the blurred man in the photograph. His shape was more defined now than it had been in the images left for others. The outline of his shoulders was clear. The way his hand rested on the man's in the photograph seemed deliberate. Supportive, almost. But the more he stared, the more he wondered, was the man beside him someone to fear or someone to follow? The date suggested an answer, but it wasn't one he could interpret yet. The cycle was moving forward. His part was simply to hold his place until the next turn. On the 7th day, something changed. He woke to find an object on the windowsill that hadn't been there before. A coin, smooth, heavy, with the same strange curved symbol etched into its surface. It hadn't been there the night before. He placed it in the dish by the door without much thought, but when he glanced back an hour later, it was gone. In its place was a folded slip of paper. It contained only 2 words, "Be ready." His pulse quickened. He didn't know what it meant, but he didn't have to. He understood the pattern by now. Things appeared when they needed to. The coin had marked the next step. The paper was a confirmation. His role was no longer to question. His role was to prepare. The whispers returned that night, faint at first, not full words, just tones, suggestions in the quiet. He lay still, not resisting, letting the sound move through the apartment, like water through pipes. They were neither comforting nor frightening anymore. They were familiar. By the second hour, the whispers grew clearer, just enough to form one sentence. "It will come to you." He thought of the date again. February 14th, 2029. It wasn't so far away. A part of him wondered if he would meet the next tenant before then, if the cycle would introduce itself early. The idea didn't feel impossible. The more time he spent in the apartment, the more he realized time itself didn't behave the same way here. On the 10th day, there was a soft knock at the door. Not the 3 measured taps he had grown accustomed to, just a single hesitant knock. He opened it cautiously. The hallway was empty, but on the mat outside was a velvet box, not the same as the one he had received. This one was older, its edges worn, its surface faded. He brought it inside carefully and placed it on the table. He didn't open it. He didn't have to. He knew what was inside. The box was not for him. It was for whoever came next. The days blurred after that. The man began moving through the apartment, almost as a caretaker. He kept the rooms clean, the air undisturbed, the table always clear, except for the box and the photograph. There was no fear in him anymore, only an odd, patient certainty. The knocks came occasionally now, soft and irregular, but they didn't startle him. They were not calling for him anymore. They were checking the space, waiting for the right moment to begin again. He realized then that this was not a haunting, it was an inheritance. The ring on his finger was not a curse, it was a marker, and soon it would pass on. The days stretched longer, the kind of long that doesn't measure in hours, but in the weight of quiet moments. The man began to realize the apartment wasn't a place he lived in anymore, it was a place he kept. The ring on his finger didn't feel foreign now, it felt like skin. He still noticed the date on the photograph when he passed the table, but its meaning had shifted. It was no longer an event to fear, but one to anticipate. February 14th, 2029 wasn't a deadline. It was a door. He had stopped marking off days on the calendar. The apartment existed on its own rhythm, and that rhythm was all that mattered. When he slept, he sometimes dreamed of hallways again, pale corridors with the blurred man waiting at the end. But now, in the dreams, he wasn't walking toward the figure. He was standing beside him, watching. One morning, he noticed something new. The box on the table was closed again. He had left it open for weeks, but now the lid sat firmly shut, the surface clean. He didn't remember touching it. He didn't even remember thinking about it. But the air in the room shifted the way it always did before a change. A part of him understood without words. The box wasn't his anymore. His hand hovered over it, but he didn't open it. He didn't need to. Whoever it belonged to next would open it when the time came. The apartment was making preparations. The coin returned 3 days later, this time in the center of the living room floor. He picked it up and turned it over, expecting the same curved symbol, but the coin was blank now, smooth, heavy, without markings. He placed it in the dish by the door, but didn't look at it again. That night, the whispers came with a clarity he hadn't heard in weeks. The door will knock again. He didn't respond. He simply sat in the chair by the table, listening to the silence afterward. The date drew closer. He began to notice small changes in the apartment again, the way the shadows shifted in the corners, the faint hum returning to the walls at night. It wasn't loud enough to unsettle him. It was steady, predictable. The hum was like a low, constant reminder that the cycle was never ending, that his role was almost complete. On February 10th, he woke to find a second photograph on the table. This one didn't show him. It showed a different figure entirely, sitting in the chair where he had once found himself weeks ago. The back of the photograph carried no name, only the date. February 14th, 2029. By February 13th, the apartment felt different again. The air was heavier, but not suffocating. It was the kind of weight a room carries when it is ready for someone else to arrive. The man didn't pack his things. There was nothing to pack. His suitcase had been empty for weeks. The ring was still on his finger, warm and constant. The whispers were steady now, like a conversation he couldn't quite hear. It's ready. It's almost time. The door, he didn't move much that day. He stayed near the table, the box, the photographs. When February 14th came, he didn't hear the 3 measured knocks at 2:14 a.m. Instead, there was a single knock, sharp, deliberate, at 2:14 p.m. He opened the door without hesitation. The hallway was empty, but the air outside the door felt different, alive in a way it hadn't been in months. He stepped back into the apartment and saw the box sitting neatly in the center of the table again. It was no longer his. It was ready. He sat in the chair by the window, the ring warm against his skin, and waited. Late that evening, footsteps echoed faintly in the hallway. They paused outside the door. The sound was not impatient. It was steady. The man didn't move. He knew how the cycle worked. He knew who the footsteps were meant for. The air shifted one last time as the door handle turned slowly. Somewhere in the space between light and shadow, the cycle began again. The apartment was never truly empty for long. It had a way of filling itself again, almost as though it had its own timetable for these things. The new tenant arrived in the late afternoon, alone, carrying only 2 cardboard boxes and a coat tucked under one arm. Their steps were cautious, measured, as if crossing into a place they instinctively knew was different. The lock turned with a hollow click that seemed to echo faintly down the hall. When the door closed behind them, the silence of the apartment folded around their presence like an old curtain being drawn. It wasn't an unfriendly silence, at least not at first. It felt more like the quiet of something that had been waiting, the still air shifting just slightly to accommodate this new inhabitant. They set their boxes on the floor, exhaling in a way that suggested this was not the first place they'd moved to, but maybe one of the few that felt empty enough to begin again. Their eyes adjusted to the dimming light as they looked around. That was when they noticed the box. It sat on the table by the window, small and unassuming, a black velvet box, neat and undisturbed, the kind of object that could have been left behind, yet something about it made it seem more deliberate. The tenant walked closer, setting down their coat as they approached. The surface of the box was clean, untouched by dust, despite the apartment's faint smell of stale air. They lifted it carefully, surprised at how light it felt. Turning it over in their hands, they found no markings, no clasp, no engraving, just a stubborn lid that refused to open. It wasn't locked in the traditional sense. It simply resisted, like something inside had decided it wasn't ready to be seen. After a moment, they set it back exactly where they'd found it, telling themselves it wasn't theirs to deal with. But as they stepped away, They glanced back. The table looked strange without it. The first day passed without incident. The tenant unpacked in the quiet, arranging belongings carefully in each room. The apartment had a stillness that was hard to name. It wasn't the muffled quiet of thick walls, nor the isolation of an empty building. This quiet felt different. It was as if the air was waiting, holding itself back, the way someone does when they're listening intently. The tenant tried to fill the silence with music. They set their phone on the counter and played a soft playlist, but the sound seemed wrong. Not distorted, not broken, just diminished, muted, like the walls absorbed the notes before they could travel. After an hour, they turned it off. Silence returned like it had been waiting outside the door. They unpacked the rest of the day, each footstep feeling faintly heavier than it should, as though the floor had learned the pattern of someone else's steps long ago. That first night, sleep came easily enough. The tenant was tired from the move, from the weight of carrying their own life in boxes. But sometime in the night, they woke without reason. No noise had startled them, no sudden movement. They simply opened their eyes to darkness and the stillness of the room. For a long moment, they listened. Nothing. Yet there was a strange sensation, faint but undeniable, the sense of someone standing just beyond the door. Not moving, not knocking, just there. They stayed in bed, heartbeat steady but alert, listening until they fell asleep again without realizing. On the second morning, the box on the table had moved. Only slightly, but enough to notice. It was now placed exactly in the center of the table, perfectly aligned. The tenant frowned, but dismissed it as an oversight. They must have placed it there without thinking. They ignored it, setting their focus on arranging the shelves and sorting the last of their belongings. Yet every time they entered the room, their eyes went to the box. It wasn't imposing, it wasn't threatening, it just belonged there, in a way that made everything else around it look slightly misplaced. By the third night, the quiet of the apartment felt heavier. It wasn't suffocating, but it was deliberate, like the space itself was aware of the time. The tenant kept glancing at the clock, not realizing why. The ticking seemed just a little louder at certain points, though they couldn't pinpoint when. That night, they woke again. This time at exactly 2:14 a.m. The air was still, perfectly still. Then from the door came 3 soft knocks, measured, calm, deliberate. They froze in bed, staring toward the sound in the dark. The knocks repeated after a pause, exactly the same rhythm. There was no hurry in them, no anger, just patience. The tenant didn't move, didn't speak. After a few moments, silence returned, settling over the room, in a way that felt heavier than before. The quiet stretched long into the early morning. When the sun rose, the box on the table was open. The box being open changed everything. The tenant noticed it as soon as they walked into the room, and for a moment they stood frozen in the doorway. The lid sat perfectly upright, the inside lined with deep velvet. At the center, resting in the hollow of the fabric, was a single object, a ring. Its metal gleamed faintly in the morning light, not bright, not polished, but as though it had been warmed by someone's skin. They stepped forward slowly, as if approaching an animal that might startle. It wasn't fear that held them back. It was hesitation, like stepping too close too quickly might break some unspoken rule. They leaned in, peering closer. Inside the band there was an engraving, just visible enough to catch their breath. It was their name, and beneath it, a date, February 14th, 2030. The numbers didn't look freshly carved. They looked worn, as though the engraving had existed long before this day. They pulled back sharply, heart racing. The box stayed where it was. The ring didn't move. They circled the table once, unable to shake the feeling that this was somehow meant for them, even though it was impossible. There was no reason for it to be here, no reason for it to bear their name, and the date, 2 years in the future, hung in their mind like a shadow they couldn't touch. They didn't touch the ring. They didn't close the box. They simply left it there, telling themselves they'd ask the landlord about it. But the thought felt hollow. Deep down, they knew the box wasn't here because of the landlord. It was here because of them. That night, the knocks returned. This time, they didn't wake at random. They woke as though something had drawn them up from sleep at precisely 2:14 a.m. The air was heavier, charged with something that made each breath feel slower. The 3 knocks came, calm and measured. From the door, they didn't move. They lay still, listening. The knocks came again, and then, after a pause, a voice, low, steady, barely more than a whisper, spoke 2 words: "Say yes." The words were not urgent. They weren't a plea. They were patient, as though time itself was waiting for their answer. The rest of the night was sleepless. The tenant didn't get up to check the door. They didn't move the box. But in the silence that followed the voice, they felt as though the apartment had shifted somehow, as if the space had taken 1 step closer to them. The whispers didn't return, but the quiet had changed. It was no longer neutral. It had intent. They found themselves watching the clock more often during the next day, their eyes drawn to it without realizing. Each time they passed the table, their gaze lingered on the ring. The engraving felt heavier in their thoughts. The date etched there, pulsing like a quiet promise. On the 5th day, they tried to move the box. They thought about locking it away in a drawer or putting it in the closet. But no matter where they placed it, the next time they entered the room, it was back in the center of the table, open, the ring waiting. They stopped trying. It wasn't fear. It was the realization that the box didn't operate by their rules. This wasn't something they could control, and slowly they began to feel less like an intruder in this pattern and more like a participant. The knocks didn't come every night. Some nights passed in complete silence, and on those nights they dreamed. They dreamed of a pale corridor, endless light stretching forward. At the far end stood a figure, blurred and still. They couldn't see the face, but the figure was holding something, a small black box, the same box that now sat on their table. They woke from those dreams unsettled but calm, the kind of calm that comes from inevitability. It wasn't a question of if anymore. It was only a question of when. The date on the ring was no longer just an inscription. It was a shadow that settled quietly over each day. February 14th, 2030. The tenant didn't circle it on a calendar, didn't mark it on any wall. It existed entirely in their head, steady, unshakable. It felt as though the date had been waiting long before they had ever seen it. In the days following the discovery, the apartment seemed to adjust in ways too subtle to name. The light lingered differently. Evenings seemed to arrive with an extra fraction of quiet, the kind of quiet that wasn't just the absence of sound, but the careful holding of space, like a pause before a line is spoken. It wasn't oppressive yet, but it was constant. Each time the tenant glanced toward the table, the box seemed somehow more deliberate. It wasn't just placed there, it was waiting. The tenant found themselves avoiding looking at the ring for too long, but the avoidance did nothing. The date stayed in their thoughts, untouched yet closer each day. The knocks were no longer a surprise when they came. They didn't arrive every night, but there was no pattern to them either. Some nights would pass in absolute silence, the kind of silence that was almost heavy enough to hum, and then there would be a night where the knocks came at exactly 2:14 a.m., 3 soft, measured taps against the door. Always the same rhythm, never rushed. Sometimes the tenant woke naturally seconds before they started, as though some quiet part of them knew when to expect it. Other times, they were drawn from sleep by the sound itself. It was never loud, never startling. It was patient. Always patient. And sometimes the voice followed, soft, steady, and calm. Say yes. It wasn't pleading. It wasn't questioning. It sounded certain, as though the answer had already been given long ago, and the words were just a formality. The days in between the knocks seemed to stretch and fold strangely. The tenant began to notice the way the box subtly changed its position. It wasn't dramatic, just enough to make its presence feel active. Some mornings it would face slightly toward the window. Other days the lid seemed open at a fractionally different angle. The ring never moved, but its presence felt alive in a way objects aren't supposed to be. The tenant no longer tried to move the box. They didn't close it. They didn't put anything else on the table. It wasn't a conscious rule, but the table seemed wrong when cluttered. It felt as if the space was meant for one thing alone, and the more the days passed, the more natural it felt to leave it exactly as it was. The apartment seemed right that way, balanced. The dreams became a fixture of their nights. The pale corridor appeared over and over, its endless stretch of light now familiar. At the far end stood the blurred figure, still unmoving. Each time the figure held something in their hand. The small black box, it was always the same. The box, the stillness, the distance between them. Some nights the tenant walked forward, their steps soundless in the dream. Other nights they simply stood and stared. But every time, just as they reached the point where the figure was almost clear, they woke. There was no fear in the waking, just an unfinished movement, as if the dream had paused, holding its conclusion for the right time. The dreams were not interruptions of sleep. They were continuations of something else. Objects began to appear in the apartment without explanation. One morning, a coin sat on the windowsill, smooth, heavy, unmarked. The tenant didn't remember ever owning it. They placed it on the table near the box, but the next morning it was gone. In its place was a small folded slip of paper. The handwriting was unfamiliar, sharp but clean. 2 words, "Be ready." The message wasn't alarming. It was matter of fact, like a reminder of something already scheduled. The tenant felt no compulsion to act. The words weren't instructions, they were confirmations. Everything was already moving toward the date. Nothing had to be done except wait. February 13th arrived without sudden shift or spectacle. The air was the same, the light just as pale. The knocks did not come that night. The silence was deeper, but not empty. It was the silence of a room holding something in place. The box sat in its usual position, open, the ring resting inside exactly as it had been for weeks. The tenant did not touch it. They did not close it. They simply noticed it in passing, the way one notices the sun in the sky, not as an object, but as a constant. That night, sleep came easily. The dreams were faint but still there, the corridor stretching out as before, the figure unchanged. At exactly 2:14 a.m. on February 14th, the voice returned. This time, there were no knocks.
There was no sound of movement beyond the door. The voice didn't come from outside at all. It came from within the apartment, from the quiet itself. It's time. The words were soft, almost a breath, but their certainty left no room for misunderstanding. The silence that followed wasn't waiting for an answer. It was waiting for an action. The date had arrived.
The voice lingered in the air long after the sound itself had faded, as though the words had been absorbed into the walls. It's time. The tenant didn't move right away. They lay in bed, listening. Every detail of the apartment etched into the silence. It wasn't fear that kept them still. It was a deep awareness that whatever was happening was not something to rush. They sat up slowly, the air around them feeling heavier, more deliberate. It was almost like stepping into a moment that had been waiting just for them. They stood, bare feet touching the cold floor, and moved toward the table without hesitation. The box sat exactly where it always had, open, the ring catching the faintest glimmer from the streetlight outside. The apartment didn't feel like it was watching. It felt like it was holding its breath. The tenant reached the table and paused. The ring had not changed. It still bore their name, still carried the same date. February 14th, 2030. They stared at the engraving for a long moment, feeling a strange familiarity in the numbers. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't even a promise. It was a confirmation of something they didn't fully remember, but somehow understood. Their hand hovered over the box, trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of inevitability. The voice didn't speak again. There were no more knocks. The silence filled the room completely, a silence that wasn't empty but brimming, like the pause between heartbeats. The moment felt alive, the air thick with a sense of completion. They took the ring in hand. It was cool to the touch, heavier than expected for something so small. The metal seemed to hold warmth in its center, as though it had been worn before. Sliding it onto their finger felt effortless, though their breath caught when it settled perfectly, as if it had always belonged there. The quiet in the room shifted, then subtle but enough to make their skin prickle. It was no longer the silence of waiting. It was the silence of something settling into place. The ring didn't change. The apartment didn't change. But the air had a weight that wasn't there before, a sense of something unseen moving just out of sight. The clock on the wall ticked softly, each sound feeling louder than usual. The tenant sat in the chair by the window, unsure why, but feeling it was the only place they should be. Outside, the night seemed stiller than usual, the streets quiet. It was as if the world beyond the apartment didn't exist in the same way tonight. They stared at the box still sitting open on the table. It didn't feel empty, even though the ring was gone. It felt prepared, waiting, not for them now, but for something else. They realized then that the box had never been theirs. It had been passing through, resting with them until the right time, and now that time had passed. The apartment stayed quiet through the night. There were no more knocks, no more whispers, just the stillness, deep and steady. The tenant didn't sleep. They didn't feel the need to. They sat with the box, the ring warm against their skin. Hours passed unnoticed, the night stretching into dawn without shift or disturbance. There was no sense of urgency, only a feeling that everything was moving forward as it should. By morning, the light filled the apartment gently, settling over the table and chair as though marking the end of something. In the days that followed, the apartment returned to its normal rhythm, or what the tenant had learned was its version of normal. The box remained on the table, closed now, its surface untouched. The ring stayed on their finger, unnoticed most of the time, except in rare moments when they'd catch their reflection and see the glint of metal. The date remained engraved there, unchanged, a quiet reminder. There were no knocks, no voices. The silence now felt content, as if the apartment was resting. It was only on the 7th day, after the ring was placed on their finger, that something shifted again. In the late afternoon, the air by the door felt different, lighter, almost expectant. The tenant didn't move. They didn't check the hallway. They simply looked at the box on the table. It had shifted slightly, angled toward the door. A realization settled over them with calm certainty. The cycle wasn't ending. It was simply moving forward, and soon the box would be waiting for someone else. The apartment was quiet for only a few days after the ring found its place on the tenant's finger. It wasn't the kind of quiet that came from emptiness. It was the kind of quiet that felt like the pause between one breath and the next. The stillness wasn't restful. It was waiting, and on the 4th day, the waiting ended. The next tenant arrived without fanfare. There were no neighbors watching the door. No sound of a moving truck, just the simple, deliberate turn of a key. The door opened, and someone stepped in carrying a single suitcase. Their movements were slow, careful, as if crossing into a place they didn't yet trust. They closed the door behind them, and the lock clicked in that faint, echoing way the apartment always made it sound. The air inside seemed to shift, wrapping quietly around the new presence, adjusting itself the way it always did. The apartment wasn't empty. On the table by the window, the small black velvet box sat in plain sight. The previous tenant was gone, but the box remained exactly where it had been, untouched, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. The new tenant paused when they saw it. They set their suitcase down and stepped closer, drawn by the way it seemed so perfectly placed. The surface was flawless, no dust, no wear, just the kind of quiet perfection that made it impossible to believe it had been sitting there for long. They picked it up carefully. It was light in their hand, almost too light for what it was. The lid wouldn't open, though there was no lock. It simply resisted, like something inside was not yet ready. They set it back down, telling themselves they would deal with it later. But when they stepped away, they couldn't help glancing back. The table looked wrong without it. The apartment greeted them in the same way it had greeted every tenant before, quietly. The air carried no smell, no trace of anyone who had lived there before. It wasn't sterile, but it wasn't warm either. It was neutral, a blank space ready to be filled. They unpacked slowly, arranging their belongings in careful order, unaware that the walls were already settling into their presence. By nightfall, the apartment felt as though it had known them for much longer than a day. The stillness was complete, but it wasn't the kind of stillness that stayed still forever. It was the kind that waited. That night, sleep came uneasily. Not because of noise, there was none. The quiet was absolute, but there was a faint sensation, like something just out of sight. They woke once in the dark, unsure why, and glanced at the door. Nothing, no movement, no sound, but the feeling lingered as they drifted back to sleep. They didn't yet know that the apartment always waited until the second night to begin. On the second night, the air changed. It was subtle, barely noticeable. The kind of shift you don't notice until after it's already happened. The tenant woke just before 2:14 a.m., their mind aware before their body. The silence felt heavy, waiting, and then softly there were 3 knocks at the door. Measured, calm, perfectly spaced. They froze, listening. The knocks came again, and then silence. The apartment stayed still for the rest of the night. The next morning, the box on the table had moved. The box hadn't just moved. It had opened. The tenant entered the room that morning to find the velvet lid standing upright, casting a long, thin shadow across the wooden surface of the table. The light had changed too. It felt colder, more focused, like the apartment had drawn the blinds without moving a thing. They walked toward the table slowly, eyes locked on the box. Inside it, resting neatly in the center of its velvet hollow, was a ring, simple, gold. A design so plain it became elegant. They reached down and picked it up, their fingers brushing against metal that felt neither warm nor cold, just present. The ring was perfectly sized. It sat in their palm like it had always belonged there. Turning it slowly between their fingers, they saw the engraving inside the band. The letters carved were unmistakable, their full name. It wasn't initials or a guess. It was exact. Beneath the name, in small, elegant numbers, was a date, but not today's. Not this year's. February 14th, 2033. They blinked, held the ring closer, and checked again. 2033. 3 years in the future. Not next week. Not next month. It didn't make sense. Their heart began to beat faster, not with panic, but with the sensation of reality slipping just slightly out of frame. They placed the ring back in the box and stepped away, but something about the air in the room had shifted. The walls no longer felt blank. The apartment no longer felt new. It felt lived in. It felt like it already knew what they would do next. The date repeated in their mind, like a hum. February 14th, 2033. It didn't make sense. They hadn't chosen that date. It didn't mean anything, yet they couldn't stop seeing it, etched not just into the metal of the ring, but now etched into their thoughts. It followed them from room to room that day. It lingered in the steam of the shower. It echoed in the ticking of the kitchen clock. The box stayed open. It never shut again. That night they avoided looking at it entirely, but their eyes betrayed them each time they passed the table. They told themselves they would throw it out, but they didn't. The knocks returned on the third night. At exactly 2:14 a.m., they woke, this time with full awareness, fully conscious the moment their eyes opened. It wasn't a dream. It was precision, as if something had reached into their sleep and pulled them back at the exact second it needed them to listen. 3 knocks, sharp, measured, then silence, and then for the first time they heard it. A voice, calm, low, and impossibly close. Say yes. They sat upright in bed, breath held, unsure if they had truly heard it. But there was no one else in the room. The voice hadn't come from outside the door. It hadn't echoed through the walls. It had been inside, spoken just behind the silence. They waited, but no more sounds came. The air remained still, but it was no longer empty. Something was in motion now. The apartment had shifted, subtly, but definitively. It was no longer offering the ring. It was expecting a decision. The tenant didn't sleep after that. They sat in the dim morning light with the ring in hand, studying the engraving. The letters were perfectly smooth, as though polished 1,000 times over. They hadn't worn it. Not yet, but the thought hovered there. What if they did? What would happen? The date began to stretch across the coming days like a shadow. February 14th, 2033. They wrote it down. They Googled it. Nothing came up. No local events. No personal memories. Just a day on a future calendar. Yet each hour that passed seemed to draw it closer, as if it wasn't 3 years away at all, as if it had already happened. That night, there were no knocks, no voice, but something far worse. They dreamed the dream didn't begin, like most dreams do. It didn't fade in or unfold gradually. It began with absolute clarity. A hallway lit in pale yellow, walls smooth, air still. At the end of the hallway stood a figure, silhouetted against a door. The door was closed, but something about it looked familiar. In the dream they felt compelled forward. Each step made no sound. Each movement felt rehearsed. As they reached the figure, it turned slowly, and though the face was blurred, they saw something shining in its hand. A ring. The same ring. Their ring as they raised their hand to reach for it. The door behind the figure opened slowly. White light poured out from within. And just before they woke, the figure whispered, "You said yes." Waking didn't bring relief. It brought disorientation. The line between dream and memory had blurred. They sat on the edge of their bed, light pouring into the room, but the words lingered like breath on glass. You said yes, but they hadn't, had they? The ring was back in the box again. They were certain they had left it on the table the night before. It hadn't been in the box, and yet there it was, resting exactly as it had when they first found it. But something about the metal had changed. It was warmer now, familiar. The feeling of it was like touching your own pulse. They didn't know what it meant, only that the apartment had closed its mouth again. For now, later that afternoon, as the sun dipped low, and the room filled with a dim amber hue, they opened a drawer in the hallway desk, and found a photograph they did not remember placing there. It was black and white, slightly curled at the edges. It showed the apartment, unchanged. The chair by the window, the box on the table, but there was someone sitting in the chair, not facing the camera, facing the box. In the photo, the person's hand was extended, ring visible on their finger, and there, just barely legible in the corner, was a handwritten note. It said, "Taken February 14th, 2033. The photograph sat on the table beside the open box for the rest of the day. They didn't touch it again after placing it there, but they found themselves glancing at it often. Something about the grainy black and white image made the apartment feel older, like the air inside had thickened with time. They knew the picture wasn't new. Its edges were worn, and the handwriting on the back looked aged, but the date scrawled on it still lay years ahead. February 14th, 2033. They turned the thought over in their mind again and again. How could something so old point to a date that hadn't happened? The apartment was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It didn't feel like stillness. It felt like something standing in another room listening. The box remained open, the ring resting inside, as if it had never been touched. The photograph leaned slightly against it, and together they looked like an arrangement someone had set deliberately. That night, sleep was thin. They woke often, each time glancing at the clock. The hours felt inconsistent, sometimes rushing past, other times stretching unbearably long. At one point, they were certain they'd been awake for only a few minutes, but the clock had jumped an hour ahead. Then later, a blink seemed to erase nearly half the night. Time felt slippery, loose. At 2:14 a.m., the knocks came, slow and patient as always. 3 taps. A pause. 3 taps again. But this time, no voice followed. The silence afterward felt heavier, layered. It wasn't just the quiet of a room holding its breath. It was as if another moment was folded inside this one, overlapping. The following morning brought something impossible. On the table, beside the box and photograph, there was now a second photograph. This one was clearer, sharper in detail, though still black and white. It showed the table again, but the ring was missing from the box. The chair was empty, yet in the reflection of the window, a figure stood faintly visible. The shape was hard to define, but their hand was lifted slightly, the faint outline of the ring on their finger, unmistakable. They turned the photo over. Again, there was handwriting, but this time, the date was different. February 14th, 2034. Days began to blur. They would wake in the morning certain it was Wednesday, but find the clock claiming Thursday. Sometimes, they'd place something on the counter, only to turn back moments later and find it gone, only to reappear, hours later, where it had been. The apartment seemed to bend itself around the edges of time, folding moments, until there was no clear before or after. The photographs on the table shifted slightly each morning, sometimes leaning in a new direction, sometimes accompanied by a third, fourth, or fifth image. Each one was of the table, the box, or the faint outline of the ring, and in each one, the date written on the back was a year later than the last. The ring itself began to feel heavier in its box. They never moved it, they never wore it. But there were moments when, walking past the table, they could swear they heard a faint metallic sound, as if the ring shifted slightly against the velvet lining. At night, the dreams became more vivid. The hallway was the same, pale light stretching endlessly, but now the figure at the end seemed closer. The ring glinted on their hand, brighter than before. The tenant would wake with the echo of the voice in their mind. You said yes, not as a command, not as a question, as a statement of fact, delivered from somewhere they had not yet reached. One evening, as the sun set, they noticed something strange about the photograph from 2033. It was no longer entirely black and white. A faint trace of color had seeped in, the gold of the ring's band, barely visible but undeniable. The rest of the image remained monochrome, but the ring glowed faintly, like the first drop of paint on a blank canvas. They set the photograph back down and stepped away, their chest tight, with the unshakable knowledge that time was not moving toward them. It was already here, folding itself into the apartment piece by piece. That night, there were no knocks at 2:14. There was no voice. But the clock behaved strangely. The second hand froze for nearly a minute, then began ticking backward. The tenant sat upright in bed, staring at the clock, heart pounding as the seconds unwound. It stopped again, at exactly 2:14. The apartment was silent, but it was no longer still. They could feel it, a shift like someone stepping just out of sight. And then from somewhere deep in the quiet, the voice spoke again. It's close. The apartment felt heavier that morning, as if the walls themselves had thickened overnight. The air was dense, hard to move through, the kind of atmosphere that made each step feel measured. On the table, the photographs had changed again. The one marked 2033 was now fully in color. The table, the box, the window, but the chair was empty. The photograph marked 2034 had changed as well. The reflection in the glass was clearer. The figure was no longer just a faint outline. They could see the ring glinting on their finger, the gold catching a light that wasn't in the room. It was the same ring that still sat in the box on the table. Only, it didn't look like it belonged there anymore. It looked like it belonged in the reflection. They picked up the ring and felt its weight differently this time. It wasn't heavy in the physical sense. It was heavy in the way a promise is heavy. The knocks came that night, different from before. Not 3-1, a single deliberate knock at exactly 2:14 a.m. It wasn't followed by silence. This time, the voice came immediately after, closer than ever. It's time. They didn't hesitate. They stood, walked to the table, and slid the ring onto their finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been waiting for this moment. The moment the ring settled in place, the photographs on the table shifted. The image marked 2033 was gone. In its place was a new photograph. Freshly printed, the ink still faintly damp. It showed the tenant now, seated at the table, the ring on their hand, the box closed. On the back the date read, February 14th, 2036. The air in the apartment changed instantly. The heaviness lifted, replaced by a quiet so deep, it felt almost peaceful. The voice didn't return. The knocks didn't come. The box sat closed for the first time in weeks. The tenant placed it neatly at the center of the table, their hand brushing over its smooth surface. They didn't need to open it. They didn't need to look at the photographs again. The cycle was no longer about what they needed to know. It was about what came next. And now they understood what the next would be. Over the next days, the apartment was still. No shifting shadows, no lost time, no new dreams. The ring stayed on their finger, warm to the touch, almost forgettable, except in moments when it caught the light. Unexpectedly, the box didn't move. It didn't open. But the stillness wasn't empty. It was patient, the same patience the apartment had shown before. They found themselves cleaning the table without thinking, leaving it bare except for the box. They kept the space as they had found it when they first arrived. It wasn't instruction. It was instinct. On the seventh night, just before midnight, they felt it, the shift. It was small at first, a subtle change in the air near the door. The temperature dropped slightly, just enough to make their breath visible for a moment. Then came the faint sound, the turning of a key in the lock. The tenant didn't move. They simply sat at the table, hands folded neatly, the box placed directly in front of them. The door opened slowly, footsteps crossed the threshold. A new presence entered the apartment. The new tenant stopped short when they saw the table, the box, the chair by the window. They set down their single suitcase and stared, a faint crease forming on their brow. The apartment was quiet. It was waiting. They stepped closer, drawn the same way every tenant had been drawn before. They reached for the box. Their hand hovered over it, uncertain, but compelled. The current tenant didn't speak. They didn't need to. The cycle was moving forward on its own. The door closed. The apartment settled into its quiet once again. The box sat waiting, the date inside unknown to the new tenant. But it was already written. The cycle didn't begin. It didn't end. It simply continued. And somewhere, deep in the silence, the voice whispered, so softly it might have been the air itself, "Say yes." And so, the ring waits once again. Another date is engraved. Another future is quietly sealed. The knocks will return when the time is right, and the voice will whisper to someone new, "Say yes." Perhaps the cycle has no end. Perhaps it's already moving toward someone watching this now. If you've been drawn in by this unsettling story, there's more waiting, more cursed histories, more unexplained patterns, more stories the world has tried to forget. Subscribe now and join us as we uncover the deeper, stranger truths hiding just out of sight. You won't want to miss what comes next.